60 years ago, when Queen Elizabeth came to the throne, life in Britain was very different to the way it is today. It looks like another era, but it still burns brightly in living memories.
Everybody who was of my generation will tell you what it was like to have their first banana or sweeties and chocolate.
And it was a nation starting to transform itself.
The jet engine, an amazing invention. It's all taken for granted now when you get on an aeroplane and it takes you all around the world.
Now, using glorious colour footage from the period and the coronation itself, much of it never previously broadcast, we explore what Britain was really like 60 years ago. How did people live? How did their choices shape our modern world? And why was the coronation such a pivotal event?
Somehow it was a turning point. Everything seemed to get better.
This is the remarkable story of the coronation year in colour, brought to life through the images and memories of the people who were there.
And then the Queen turned around and said, "Are you ready, girls?"
On the 2nd of June 1953, Elizabeth II was crowned Queen of the United Kingdom and head of the Commonwealth. No expense was spared to mark this great event, a moment which signalled a hopeful new future for Britain.
This was the first good news that we really had. We were coming out of rationing. It was the Queen, this young princess that everybody adored.
Only 16 months earlier, when Elizabeth had acceded to the throne, Britain had seemed locked in the past, still damaged by the war. But it was a nation desperate to rebuild, and Elizabeth gave it the belief that change was possible.
And here was this young, beautiful queen and a figurehead for the country, and it almost felt as if it was giving the country a fresh start.
From February 1952 until the coronation, Britain began building towards this brighter future. And the first problem the nation tackled was housing. The war had destroyed over 2 million homes across Britain, in cities like Belfast, Manchester, Coventry and London. This, and a post-war baby boom, meant homes were overcrowded, as these images from Paisley show.
To me, it was just appalling, you know. It seemed like something out of Dickens. No running water, obviously, toilets outside. 5 children to one room, or even more sometimes.
As well as being cramped, facilities for most people were fairly basic. Around half of British homes had no bathroom, so daily washing was a public activity, as Gloria Hunniford remembers.
There was only a cold water tap, and it would have been in our scullery, as it was called. But when you're going to school in the morning, you know, unless your mum had boiled your kettle of water, you were washing and everything in cold water.
And no bathroom meant no loo.
The toilet was in the backyard, and it didn't matter what degrees it was in terms of the winter. We had to go out into the yard, and it was all terribly primitive. But you kind of accepted it because that's just the way it was.
With everybody in the same boat, people seemed to look out for each other.
I think there was much more watching out the windows, and you could always tell what neighbours were doing, at least 6 houses either side of the street. And you were aware of your neighbours, and you knew your neighbours usually, and whether it be good or bad, they existed in your life, in your circle.
Churchill's government made improving housing its #1 priority. It promised 300,000 new homes by the end of 1953, and it delivered. Bomb sites were cleared, and prefabs and council estates were built nationwide. But the big innovation new towns sprang up mainly in the south to house the survivors of London's Blitz.
Each neighbourhood must have its own
churches,
community centre,
shopping districts,
and lots of pubs. Rent next door to me.
New towns offered an escape from the cramped and chaotic conditions of bomb-damaged cities. Families moving there were offered a clean, modern, and above all, ordered lifestyle.
detached houses, semi-detached, terraced houses.
By the end of March 1952, 420 families had moved into homes like these in Stevenage, Britain's first new town. Peter Blagg's family were among the earliest residents.
People were leaving London for definitely a new life, almost a promised land, he might say. And this is the house we moved into first of all. The big thing was that we had an indoor toilet, which was a luxury. There was a small one on the side of the house, so we went from sharing one with the whole house outdoors to having two of our very own. My mother walked up this pathway here, looked around, couldn't believe she was walking into her house. She had never had her house before.
Mothers and fathers in 1952 had strictly defined roles.
It seemed to be that the man made the money, he went out to work, and the woman, certainly according to my father, stayed at home to do the cooking and the nurturing.
Men were the heads of households, and their homes were their castles.
In those days, men didn't change nappies. They didn't bath the children. But that was because they were out earning all day, and there was a division of labour in the household. It wasn't that the man felt that somehow this was beneath him. There were just completely defined roles.
Single women could work, but the government expected them to quit when they married. This meant more jobs for men and pushed women indoors to care for their families. Indeed, the government warned that children separated from their mothers would be psychologically damaged. But there was one woman who broke these establishment rules: the Queen. Despite objections from senior government figures, she was determined to work.
I would have thought that she would have reacted to the duty of being a queen or a king is to be a public figure. And you're not doing your job if you're just becoming a nice little suburban housewife looking after your husband and children.
The Queen's actions inspired some young women that in the future they too could have a choice. One of those was Welsh schoolgirl Heather Morgan.
I suppose the fact that we now had a young queen on the throne was quite a big shift in emphasis for women, and it was very revealing for us young women to see her consort one step behind her, and we quite liked that idea, some of us.
In 1952, though, women's lib was still some way off. Even if married women had wanted to work, a lack of household appliances made it impossible. Running their homes was a full-time job.
Everything had to be done by hand, and there were no mod cons whatsoever. So when I think that my father would say to my mum, no woman of mine is going out to work, you know, woman's place is in the home, etc. Probably the work at home was a lot harder than actually going out and doing the job. But, you know, my mum always did it with a smile and never, ever complained.
In 1952, around 80% of homes had no washing machine, so housewives had to do all their laundry by hand, which often took a whole day. And as only a tiny 5% of families had a fridge, housewives had to go food shopping more regularly, as Paul King recalls.
Shopping in those days was a totally different experience from today. You shopped daily, not weekly. You saw nobody carrying big bags around. They was all just daily shopping.
And keeping food fresh was a particular challenge.
If it was very hot, my father would dig a hole in the garden and put the milk in it, amongst the cold soil. That was the way we lived. Many people did that, millions.
The actual shopping itself was also very different.
You could not just go to a shop, as you can today, and buy anything you want. No, we were still rationed.
Food rationing was introduced during the war to ensure everyone had a fair share of the available resources. Even the royal family was rationed. And 7 years after the conflict ended, rationing was still in place.
Everybody had these coupon books, and you could only buy certain amounts of items per week. From memory, I think everything was on rationing. Tea, bacon, eggs, meat. Everything was very restricted in terms of choice and availability.
Meat was in particularly short supply. In fact, a man would blow a whole week and a half's meat ration by buying just one steak. And rationing also restricted butter, sugar, and sweets.
I remember doing a dreadful thing. I wanted to bake a cake. I used up a lot of coupons because cakes take flour and butter and eggs and everything else. And then when it came out of the oven, we had to use a hammer to break it. So my mother was very upset. All our precious coupons were totally gone down the drain.
The ever-ingenious British public soon found ways around the food shortages. In 1952, hard-to-come-by goods had a habit of falling off the back of lorries. And the black market was an everyday part of people's lives.
The other word was under the counter. If you could find somebody who could let you have something which was on rations, you gave him some money for it, so forth. It gave rise to this phrase, the black market, but it was just a phrase people used. You got extra sausages. I got them on the black market.
And decades before we were encouraged to grow our own, back gardens were put to work for the dinner table.
Everybody who had a garden had a vegetable patch, never mind the azaleas. You got on with the cabbages. And the slogan in the war had been dig for victory, and most people carried on digging for a very long time.
You had to have what was available at the time. There was no flying in food from Africa or South America or anything else like that. So the diet was basic.
But times were changing. Soon rationing would be a thing of the past, and kitchens would be moving into the future.
No wonder she looks so relaxed. So would I be with that cooker in my kitchen.
In March 1952, the Ideal Home exhibition suggested that every home would soon be full of labour-saving mod cons.
I can remember discussions in the family home about the refrigerator and the washing machine, and my family definitely aspired to have all of these.
Only 2 months into the Queen's reign, and already things were changing. Buckingham Palace increased the optimism by announcing June 1953 as the coronation date. And over the next 14 months, Britain would continue its transformation.